India today. And she has been on the scene for a while. She just reminded me that we met last in Khajuraho Dance Festival, which means the last time we met must have been in 1990 or 89 or something like that. But as you, oh please put this off. Yours and mine as well. I have always held that this is one of the most uncivilizing instruments that man has invented. Because you're sitting, talking to somebody sitting next to you, and all of a sudden you get a call and you go away, which is a very uncivilized thing to do. Anyway, so please put it off, like I do. Well, as you know, ALARMEL VALLI embody your own personal aesthetic vision. And she is one of them who has done it remarkably and outstandingly well. She has had a series of awards, Padma Bhushan, Chevalier of Arts and Letters from the French government, Sangeet Natak Academy Award, etc. And films have been made on her by the Indian National Archives called Pravahi, by Arundhati, and then by BBC, and then last Shikavya, The World of ALARMEL, a film by Sankalp Mishra. And she has performed all over the world, in the Bolshoi Theatre, the Avignon Festival, the Vienna International Dance Festival, New York International Festival of Arts, the Venice Biennale, the Israel Festival. And occasionally she also dances in India, whenever she finds time. And she has founded the Deep Shikha Dance Foundation and Educational Trust. Well, we are very happy and welcome to you, madam, for having agreed to come and talk. We'll give the flowers at the end because, you know, they come in the way. I don't know where to keep them. So we'll give them while you leave. Now, to talk to ALARMEL VALLI, we have Arundhati Subramaniam. She's a poet, much better than me, but like me. She writes in English. She has been given, I had something to do with 2 awards that she won. One was the Raza Award, and the other one was the first Khushwant Singh Memorial Prize, which she was given last year in the Jaipur Literature Festival. And she has published 3 books of poems, most recently Where I Live, New and Selected Poems. And then she has written, she combines a rather, how do you say, a very impressive physical presence with deep spirit, with spirituality, with metaphysics. So she has written on Sadhguru, she has written a book on the Buddha, and recently she has edited a wonderful anthology on bhakti poetry from various languages. Kapila ji, सामने आ जाइए. हेलो करके भी सामने तो करिए ना. No. Apart from these awards, she has won the Charles Wallace Fellowship, the Homi Bhabha Fellowship, And for a long number of years, she worked with the National Center of Performing Arts in Mumbai, where she was in charge of classical dance. So she is one of the few poets that I know of, other than me, who are deeply interested in the other forms. And dance being the more difficult of them, the music is comparatively more overwhelming and simple. Anyway, so there she is, and the rules of the games are simple. They'll talk about an hour. Hopefully, ALARMEL VALLI will talk more, which means Arundhati would allow her to talk more and provoke her to talk more. And then, after they're finished, then it will be open to you, to the house, if there are comments, brief comments and brief questions. So prepare yourself for that, and don't think of too long, complicated questions using the postmodern lingo, hegemonical or whatever, post-colonial, blah, blah, blah. Ask simple questions. Although these are very intelligent ladies, but still, for others who are not so intelligent like us, ask simple questions. My job is over. Over to Arundhati.
It's working? It doesn't seem to be.
It needs to be a little louder.
Yeah, we need a little volume.
थोड़ा वॉल्यूम बढ़ाना क्या है इसका नाम क्या है राजेश
Is it working now?
Flowers.
Thank you, Ashok. And before we move into the conversation, I thought I would just say from my end, just offer 3 reasons why I think ALARMEL VALLI is special. I think in the course of this conversation, you will probably arrive at your own conclusions, your own set of reasons. But for me, having watched VALLI for over 3 decades, and having known her, and having had that interaction deepen in the latter half of those 3 decades, I'd like to offer my own personal take on what I think makes her an unusual artist. 1, the fact that she is extraordinarily articulate, and not just in her program notes, which is where an alarming number of performers seem to be at their most fluent, but in her dance. And when you hear her today, if you haven't heard her before, you'll find just how eloquent she is, but she's that much more eloquent on stage, which is where it really counts. And that eloquence never degenerates into glibness, which is my personal reason for trusting her and trusting her work. The second reason, her engagement with the allied forms of dance, that is classical music and poetry, is an engagement of tremendous depth, rigor, and attentiveness. When I watched VALLI choreograph an item, and I've watched her choreograph several, I realized that there is nothing perfunctory, nothing impatient, nothing instrumental about the way in which she transacts with these art forms. There is a tremendous measure of attention, of care, and above all, she isn't a dancer in a hurry. There is nothing impatient about her. So for me, watching VALLI on stage is often about watching someone who's never in a hurry, but always on time, which is something one finds so seldom. And the third reason, I remember being struck when I first watched her many years ago. I remember being struck many years ago when I watched her by her exuberance on stage, which many of you are perhaps familiar with, just the vitality, the vigor, the agility, it just took my breath away. Many years later, I find that while that vitality remains, there is a certain fineness that has entered her dance, or I'm growing more aware of it perhaps, as an older viewer. And that fineness doesn't seem to spell any loss of intensity. This interests me even as a poet. How does one achieve subtlety without the loss of voltage? This is something that matters to me a great deal, and I can imagine how much more difficult it is for a dancer whose instrument is the body. And the body, of course, undergoes its share of changes. But to be able to arrive at a certain mellowness without losing intensity, without losing access to that moltenness from which all art springs, I think that is exceptional. So that's the note on which I would like to begin this conversation. And I'm going to ask the easy question first, which is, I think, a question that many of us are curious about, Valli, about your training as a dancer, because I know that you've often said that you found yourself on the cusp of two worlds, that you had access to this more leisurely, gracious era, where you were trained by hereditary masters in the Pandanallur tradition, Chokkalingam and Subbaraya Pillai, but you've also been a performer in the modern world and a teacher in your own right. So I think it would be interesting for many of us to know something about how you viewed those early years of training, which I know have been very significant for you.
Thank you, Arun. First, she has struck me dumb by speaking about eloquence, because then, you know, that immediately makes me aware that I have to say something intelligent, which doesn't always work out that way. But you've given me an easy subject, which is my early years of training with my masters. And let me just begin by saying that I consider myself truly blessed, because what you are as an artist, the way you are shaped, the way you grow, how creative you are in your later years, I think it all begins with your mentors, those who shaped and groomed and guided you. So Pandanallur Chokkalingam Pillai, in him and his son Pandanallur Subbaraya Pillai, I couldn't have asked for more wonderful guides and mentors. You spoke about subtlety and intensity. That is so very true. And I think it begins with my training with these masters. I first started learning in this old corporation school, what they used to call a corporation school. Pitted floors, railway tracks down the side. And the most important, at least for me, the most meaningful thing, and it's something which you don't realize as a child, but I realize now what was happening, is these masters' integrity. The complete truth they brought to their teaching. The art was their religion. They didn't know about glamour, about packaging, about sophistication, about all the things that we consider important today. They didn't care who their students were, how rich or powerful the parents were, which is something of major consideration and preoccupation these days. So I think that influenced me even then, because these masters would be there and every word rang with truth and with conviction. And they taught me, I think, to begin with, that tradition is not something constraining, that I can use it to be my own dancer. And particularly Subbaraya Pillai, the son of Pandanallur Chokkalingam Pillai sir, he gave me that freedom to grow and to be myself, to express myself. So I am eternally grateful to them. One of the things that I'd like to speak about is, which again I think is important, particularly today when we dancers are under tremendous pressure to create for the sake of novelty, to be new for newness' sake. He used to speak about sarakku and minukku. Sarakku is in Tamil, it is substance, and minukku is glitter or glamour. And he was trying to introduce me to choreography. And I had done some composition with the Adavis, and he said, "Inga paru, why have you used that particular alphabet?" And I told him it looked nice, sir. Then he said, "That is a minukku Adavis, that is just very superficial. It can be used as ornamentation, but the main substance of your composition should rest on the bedrock of sarakku." And I think that is I would say it is a principle, a way of thinking that applies to everything that has happened in my life, in my art. There's another point which he used to, these masters never stood up and taught. They would always sit with their tattikari and mane. And so you might imagine, might wonder, how did they manage to convey these points? Master would sometimes, Shringaram, love, what do you know when you're 9 years old? But he would just, a little flicker of the eye. That is all he would tell you. Or with his hands, he would speak about Vallinam Melinam, that is light and shade and footwork. And then, I remember they were also trying to evolve this style because it's a very firm, strong style rooted in geometry. And they wanted, older master, Chokalingam Pillai, was trying to give it a seamless quality, to introduce grace and fluidity into the exactitude, the geometry and power of the dance. And he'd get terribly frustrated. He would say, "Tovalaya Pudi," which meant loosen up and the arms would sag. So then he once gave us this example of the toy whistle with a feather furled at the tip. And you blow on this feather and the feather unfurls into a straight line. And he said in Tamil, "Kai viriyano yeriyada," that is, unfurl the arms, don't fling it out. And that even when you're very young, it stays, that metaphor stuck in my head. And I think it made me realize, and I think this is something we've also spoken about, you have in Bharatanatyam, which is so geometric, you have point A and point B. So you have to travel from point A to point B. One straight line. But I think in later years, it helped me to understand, and I keep this metaphor at the back of my mind, it is the way you traverse between that point A and point B, or whichever point that might be, that really marks the difference between someone who's just a virtuoso performer and an artist. I would call that poetry, the way you travel. I don't know if you'll agree with me on that, but it's the way you traverse.
Definitely, the journey in some way being acknowledged as important as the destination, right? Essentially, yeah. No, I will find ways of...
I really do want her to...
I have been silenced by the moderator. No. But I know also, Valli, that you've also talked about the fact that, for one, as you said, your masters were not performers.
Mm-hmm.
That made, I'm imagining, one level of difference. Also the fact, I know you've also talked about dance pedagogy in the age of the YouTube and Skype. That is in many ways different. Yes. I'm not trying to belittle one and valorize the other, but without doing that, I think it's possible to see that this is a different experience, isn't it?
Yes. And as someone who straddles both the pre and the post-infotech eras, I think it gives me a kind of interesting perspective on the two worlds. When I started studying dancing so many decades ago, I think everyone knows my age by now, so 50 years ago, we had no recording devices, we had no DVDs, players, no all these little minuscule technology that they seem to have. The other day in class, there was a student of mine and I was trying to teach her a particular adavar. And I kept saying, if I may just demonstrate with one hand, Tadin Girna Tom. Tadin Girna Tom is the adavar. Now, I did Tadin Girna Tom and then she looked at me and she did Tadin Girna Tom. I'm sure you can see the difference, right? So I tried telling her, see, what am I doing and what are you doing that's so different? Again, she said, you are taking your elbow out. So I said, okay, what else? Then she did this. Then I said, what else? Then she said, your shoulder. So I said, yes, what happens to my shoulder? I had to take her step by step. Then I'd say, right angles. Don't do this, don't do that. Right angles at chest level, straight line back. I had to pull that adavar apart into so many components before she grasped it. And this is a very bright, intelligent student of mine. And immediately her mother took her cell phone and she started recording this whole process. And she said, Akka, don't worry. வீட்டுக்கு போய் நாங்க கட்டாயம் பார்த்துட்டு by next, family, we go home and by the next class, she will be perfect. The point here is that when we danced, master wouldn't even allow us to bring a little piece of paper to write on. So it forced you to observe very acutely, very intensely, and you had perforce to internalize in I think it was a more meaningful way, because you didn't have this crutch to lean upon of cell phones, recording cell phones. And there is another problem here. I don't know if the dancers here would agree with me or the artists would agree with me, but I think when you analyze things, I'm spoon feeding when I teach my students. I tell them in Abhinaya, I speak about transitions. I say, why are you looking here 1 minute and there the next? If there's a flower there and you're trying to say, look at it, you have to first see the flower before you register consciousness of it. Things like that. And they learn much faster than I might have really. But it's rather like making a road through a forest, and where you have to first survey the area, the landscape, the territory. You're aware of every tree, every plant, every flower, or the dangers, the animals, and then you make that path. And you reach, maybe you reach a destination, you might make little digressions along the way. But at the end of it, I think that we come out much richer when we learn the way ourselves and we discover we take every step ourselves and discover that path. We might be guided gently along. But whereas here you've made the road, and so the destination lies there. It is, I have to perform that piece slickly, efficiently, and then you get there very fast. And as I said, they do it very efficiently, with a lot of talent maybe, and technical correctness. But somewhere along the way, subtexts, you understand so much more when you have to struggle and observe intensely and then learn.
Observation is one thing, and the other thing that I've often heard you talk about, sometimes wistfully, is the sense of time that seemed to be at one point in abundance in your life. And I think the ability to learn just by dreaming, allowing oneself dream time, right? Would you like to say something more about that?
Well, I certainly do know that I've been thinking about it quite a lot of late. Before I got myself a cell phone and the iPad in particular, I think my life was so much calmer. There isn't this cacophony and this tyranny of the net that, if someone sends you mail and immediately you have to answer them. I was a more relaxed person, I definitely feel, before I had all these aids to learning and to entertaining myself. We used to travel to Kodaikanal in the holidays, and I remember how often we'd spend 6 weeks there. I'd carry a suitcase full of books, or go to this old Kodaikanal fusty, musty library with stuffed chairs, and then I discovered many of my favorite authors, Sabatini, and all these swashbuckling Baroness Orczy, Gerald Durrell. And it was a world where I'd walk down it was like a mountain path down to fairy falls, and then sit there with my book for hours. It was a safer world, a more mellow world, and you could just watch the mist drift down and dream away, like you said. And much of my creative energy I draw from those memories, the stories I heard, the quiet time, just doing nothing, chumma irit, just to be still. We lack that luxury. My students, every time you ask them, Akka, we have an exam, we have a test, I can't rehearse, Akka, tomorrow, I'm so sorry. You know, there is that constant pressure with this draconian system. And I don't know whether it is that or whether we have so many distractions by way of this, that and the other, but leisure was important.
It was, I think. And whenever she says chumma iril, as in just be, it's often offered me an insight into Valli's dance as well, really. Because she's capable of all that marvelous movement, and she is capable of such stillness. And I don't think we've talked about that part of it enough, but we will come back to that. I wanted to ask you also, based on something you said just a little while ago, about your unease, if you will, with notions of what is culturally fashionable. You know, I know Valli has often talked about what, in a way that almost seems to be a bit of an allergy. It seems to be an allergy to words that are used too easily, words like innovation, experimentation, breakthroughs and trailblazing new directions in dance. These are the sorts of phrases that make her hackles rise. And I wanted to ask you the fact that I'm aware of the fact that you are in fact not a dogmatic or calcified purist on the one hand. And I know that you've done a fair amount of work extending your repertoire when you've worked with Sangam poetry, when you've worked with the Padamanjali, even with modern English poem. You know, you've extended yourself and deepened your repertoire as well in many ways. But you've also had this, a certain level of discomfort with what I've heard you call the what's new syndrome. Am I right?
Yes.
Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, but to begin with, I just want to say that across the spectrum, the entire gamut of expression, I feel that the main thing is that you should be able to respond to any mode of art, whatever the name or the title one might choose to give it. What matters is the truth that we bring to it. The truth, the conviction, the passion, and its ability, therefore, to communicate. So, I relate to all forms of art, and I think we need many diverse forms of expression, because you can't just say classical purist and, you know, get stuck not being able to see the wood for the trees. What my problem essentially is with pretension. With those, whether in the name of modernity or in the name of the classical or whatever you choose, innovation in particular. For me, newness, mere newness alone, it doesn't constitute creativity or innovation. So it does make me uncomfortable when I hear these words about, you know, when you mystify and you talk about the energy which rises and this, and there's so many expressions. We're talking about inner space and outer space, and you write a blurb about the dance which sounds so fantastic and impressive, and finally you see the dance, whether it corresponds to what has been written about it, is a totally, there's a huge gap between what is said and what is done. So sometimes I think, unfortunately, if you don't have a discerning audience who's not honest enough to respond to something and say, yes, that speaks to me, I relate to it, I can respond to it, or I can't, then you play to that gallery, and then you jump onto whatever bandwagon there is which happens to be fashionable or politically correct or whatnot. I think the compulsion has to come from within, that growth has to be organic, not because someone is telling you do something that way and that's what you need. Because if you have that truth of conviction, whether it is a varnam or an abstract piece of modern dance, which is totally outside the vocabulary of classical Indian dancing, that truth will speak to someone who is themselves open to truth. I think it also is a two-way process. You have to be able to, I'm sure you will agree with me on that, that if you are also, you come there with openness, an open heart and open mind, and we respond with our hearts and our minds, our heart and our mind, then I think that art has relevance. So when we speak of social relevance, for me, and this is a very personal point of view, people may disagree with it, I really think human relevance is vitally important. If there is such a thing that there are certain forms of art which can make powerful social statements and comments. Personally, I think Bharatanatyam scope, it can't be everything. You can use the vocabulary for something else, whatever you want. But if you speak specifically of the classical idiom, what it does for me, as a Rasika, as a dancer, and what I hope it does for the sensitive Rasika, I think is that it harmonizes, it heals, and it makes me feel like a better person. If I may share a little story.
Please.
I don't know if she's here, but a journalist from Delhi once rang me up. This was some years ago when you had that horrific Nirbhaya incident. I had for 3 months stopped reading newspapers prior to that because I was getting so disturbed mentally and perturbed about all the scams and the rapes and whatever I was reading about. I said, I'm giving it a miss for 3 months. So I had not read about the incident, and this lady rang up and she said, this is the Madras season. So, there's been I said, what? And she said, this rape. And she said, are you going to, I think she asked whether they were planning to stop the performances for a while. And I cringe when I think she must have, I don't know what she thought about me, because I didn't even know where she was coming from. So I said, these things are happening and we have to be very sensitive to this, do something about it. But the season, people go there to classical concerts or to dance performances, and all that ugliness and the violence, if you can come away feeling a better person, I think it has some relevance there. I didn't even know what she was talking about. But in retrospect now, I think back and I feel embarrassed about my statement. But I also feel that when it comes to classical, the arts, when I dance, I feel that I am at my best as a human being. I feel all that is best in me is crystallized. And if I can touch people with something of that feeling, then I feel I have done my bit also through my art. I have contributed in some measure. And to that extent, I don't know if you'll agree with me on this, that there is relevance. It has a human relevance.
I think what you're also talking about is resisting narrow ideas of relevance and topicality, which I think certainly many of us negotiate as poets as well and writers. But we're constantly sometimes being, not perhaps constantly, but very often being encouraged to be sociologists, and there is an impulse to turn to poetry for sociology rather than sensuousness, which to my mind is a tragedy. You turn to other texts for sociology, and I think to believe that one has to choose is itself a horrible choice. Absolutely. Right?
Absolutely.
It's made in an either-or scenario almost. And I actually believe it has a great deal to do with the question that many of us were asked in school. I don't know how many of you were asked this. I was. What is the poet trying to say? Yeah. And with that question, it seemed like there was a gash, a terrible split that took place between form and content, between style and substance, right?
It's precisely,
yeah.
You put it in a nutshell. We face that also every day as dancers, these very same questions you spoke about. And ultimately, I think it has to be something that is spontaneous, that comes out from within, and not something that's grafted on from outside. And then I think it has meaning. And it can resonate with people at different levels, different moments, different ways.
I know that you've often talked of dance as celebration, as joy. And I think for many of us who've watched you on stage, that is palpable. But it would be interesting if you also talked a little about how that moment happens. Now, I know this is a surprise question. We had a vague sense of the terrain we'd cover, but on occasion I'm allowed to ask questions that you weren't prepared for. Which is, I'm often curious to know how those moments of celebration happen. What leads up to that? How does it happen? If you could just offer some sense of process or some sense of what it is to be on stage, perhaps.
I'd like to go back again to my childhood. Chothalingam Pillai, I remember when we were dancing, he would say something, he would say, Jadam Mari Adade, which I didn't know what the word meant. It actually meant zombie. Don't dance like a zombie. And he'd say, Rasichipudi, enjoy, savor, rasa, savor every moment that you are performing. And I have a feeling, this is my theory, that, in the process of making dance, classical dance, respectable, so to speak, for so-called respectable society to accept, they had to, in a sense, expurgate the dance. It had to be distilled of what they considered impurities, which was the sensuality aspect. But in the process, I think, maybe at some point, again this is conjecture, they had distilled it of all fragrance, all taste and all color. And I suspect that the older master in particular, he was perhaps trying to restore some of that full-blooded quality of joy in movement. And every movement has its own feel to it. When I was younger, when I was about 16 and 17, I used to get terribly irritated because one or two critics said, oh, ALARMEL VALLI does abhinaya in her nrita. So, this is from Abhinava Gupta, and we get this whole idea that nrita should not have any feeling. It's not abhinaya, it is joy. And each movement has a feel. This is more commanding, this is more, it's more sensuous. So he was encouraging us to liberate us in a sense, to enjoy the physicality of the dance in the way you should enjoy it. So I think it begins there, that process. What is it like to perform? It's like, what is it like to eat? It's
one hell of a difficult question, but I have to ask.
For me it is, as I said, when I get up on stage, all I can tell you is each one of us accesses the art, connects with it very differently. And whether it's poetry also or anything, I think, right?
It's different. I mean, poetry not being a performing art in that sense.
That sense, yes, okay. But for a performing artist, I think for me, when I'm on stage, and this is a comment many people have made, they said, my God, after you meet me, sometimes it's rather dispiriting because they tell me, my God, you're so different on stage, you're a different personality, and I don't think they mean it in a complimentary way, the off-stage and the on-stage presence, that on stage I do feel that I can be myself, that I can realize my potential in a way I cannot in normal day-to-day life. So there is when I said, no, the best in me is crystallized. Someone asked me, Sankat Meshram, what is dance to you? And I said, when I dance, I'm a poet. Excuse me for taking that liberty and calling myself a poet, but in dance I feel I am. Because dance is a language, and with it we write our poetry. That's what I feel. I think we paint because the dance songs are the outlines and we add colors and bring that picture to life. We create, we paint our spaces. And we sing with our bodies when we dance. So, and ultimately for me it's a prayer. Because truly, when I say that all that is best in me comes together, that moment of intensity, that bindu, if you like, that point where everything comes together, that intensity, for me, that is dance.
In fact, it seems like the right moment to actually go into also what I was talking about earlier, which is your engagement with music. Because Valli's learnt music from Mukta of the Brinda Mukta duo in the Veena Dhanamar tradition, known for its very leisurely, unhurried exposition of music, particularly the Padam. And I remember Valli saying to me once that Mukta was not just, Muktama was not just my music teacher, as in she made me aware of the musicality of movement, but she was more than that, she was also my Abhinaya teacher. You remember this?
Yes.
I think it would be interesting if you talked about that.
You know, for a couple of years I actually studied Abhinaya from Kalanidhi Mami, I should mention that. But I've always said, and I'm very grateful to her, but Muktama opened up the world of Abhinaya in a way which for me is truly, I keep using the word poetic, and you must think it's temerity of me to, without...
We forgive you.
Thank you.
We'll be coming to poetry soon, Valli, but let's use it.
No, because, you know, Balama is one. Bala Saraswati Amma, T. Bala Saraswati Amma. She is one of my idols, and represents an ideal of the musicality and poetry of movement in dance. I remember when I was 14 or 15, that was the year she received the Sangeeta Kalanidhi. And there was a lot of controversy. Some musicians said, oh, she's a dancer, how can she receive the Sangeeta Kalanidhi? And which was actually a limited perception of who she was, because she was a great musician. And that was what made her also a great poet, a great musician in dance. And that's what made her the artist she was. And I went to this performance. At that time, my awareness of music and poetry and dance and all that was not, definitely, I was not aware of it in that way. But I saw her do a padam in Tamil, Unnai Thoodanipinen, Yennadi Nadan. Okay, I'll say it in English. The Sakhi is asking, the heroine is asking the Sakhi, I sent you with a message to the hero. What really happened? Tell me the truth between you. Because then she goes on to say that the hair which you had combed and knotted up has come undone and is disheveled. And so on, and she points out various other suspicious signs of her dalliance. So that one word, and I was 14 or 15, Vari, which meant the hair, combed hair. She combed her hair about 20 or 30 times, not just in dance but in music. And Sangati after Sangati flowed, cadence after cadence, trill after trill, curve after curve. And you know, she combed her hair, she plaited it, then she decided she would wear it in a different style. She knotted her hair, she teased out knots. All this with that music. And at one point, I think I didn't know where the music ended, the dance began, or whether it was the dance that was singing or the music that was dancing. And for me, that was why I see the music, hear the dance. And the same Balama told me, she was some dinner party and we were talking, we meaning not me, my mother and others. She said, Abhinaya solli kudukka mudiyadu, thana varanam. Abhinayam cannot be taught, it has to flower on. I've spoken a lot about this, Arun.
No, but maybe you should talk to the audience about it.
No, I've said it because at that point, it occurred to me, how can Abhinaya not be taught? How can it flower? And then I went, and when I was 17, I went to Muktama, her first cousin, Mukta Brinda, great singers from this wonderful Veena Dhanamar Bani. And then I studied Padams and Javlis, and I cannot tell you, it was a revelation to me. My body was responding in a way. You very beautifully said it once. You said it's listening, dynamic listening. Do you remember that?
Yes, I remember that. I remember saying that the dynamic listening to the padam, especially when it's such a fine-tuned body, just the act of listening dynamically, that is the dance.
And that's precisely what happened, because I found that it was not just the music and the words that you were responding to, but you were responding to the pauses between the notes, the spaces, and your, each carving, the long stretched out notes. The body again has to flow. There is one word in a particularly desolate Kshetriya Padam, not Tishra Tirupate, which is a beat of 7 but stretched out. And Yugamu, the word Yuga, that was another Yuga, this is another Janma altogether, the heroine says to her friend. And that word Yuga stretched on to 9 beats. So what do you do if you're callow and you... Earlier I might have just heard it and then stood there and, showed the hand, Yuga, and then you don't know what happens. There's a moment of blankness, of not stillness, but emptiness. Whereas, after studying with Amma, and when I presented that whole arc of that note, with that desolation, that hand, the body, everything, there's a continuous flow and movement. And it was like, for me it was a revelation. It was the most wonderful, exciting moment of discovery that music becomes so much a part of you that when you listen, you're responding as much to the song as the music as to the words. And sometimes that's more important than the text. And so that happened. See the music here, the dance with Amma.
And in fact with Bombay Jayashree, day after tomorrow.
Oh gosh.
And it's a performance that I know many people here are likely to be going for. So I think we'd like to know something about how that particular collaboration happened. Because VALLI is often wary of collaborating. So I'm curious myself to know how that happened. Having seen them both and having seen that performance, I have a sense of why and how it might have happened. But it would be interesting to hear.
You say, tell us.
I think what struck me when I saw that performance, and in the conversation that I had with the two of you the day prior, this was in Chennai last year, I realized that actually Jayashree and VALLI are in their own ways, they're kindred spirits. And I hadn't realized that. When I actually saw them sitting, listening to each other, and I saw the number of pauses they allowed themselves in a conversation, neither trying to upstage the other, that I realized that that quality is special. Neither of them is a diva. For me, that's one big reason why I can imagine the two of them would have opted to collaborate. But there are others, which VALLI will tell us about.
You see now why I wanted, I was so keen to have Arundhati as my co-conspirator, not just fellow.
We will come to our conspiracy shortly, but first with you and Jayashree.
Well, I've been conducting this festival every year at Barney for the past couple of years, the 3rd year, and I wanted to invite Jayashree to sing. And it happened to be Muktama's centenary year, and there were a lot of people who were pressurizing me, why aren't you dancing, you should. And I said, okay, both of us perhaps we can do Padams and Javlis to celebrate Amma's memory, which is what happened. I've known Jayashree as a musician, and I also respected her greatly as a person, but I didn't know her as well as I did. When I came to actually work with her, and I was confident that she was the kind of person who wouldn't just come to it and say, okay, 3 rehearsals, 4 rehearsals, and then we have to go into the performance. And it was not a gimmick, it was not a novelty factor that made me do it, because when you want great music, we rarely get it with the singers who sing for us these days, because it's infra-dig to sing for dance. So really top quality singers won't sing for you. So what is it like to have somebody who's the best, one of the best, sing and interpret that music? Padams and Javalis are not her personal style. There were some questions why Jayashree was not from the Padam Javali school. But she answered that. She said, this is a learning experience for me. And she came to it with devotion and humility and complete open-mindedness, took the tapes of Muktama and learnt from those songs, and with complete humility. And that was what was so wonderful. And I must tell you, we did about 20 rehearsals before we could present that performance. She came all the way from the other end of town, Thiruvanmayur. It's about an hour and a half away, hour at least, from where I live. And we would work, she was wonderfully, she was willing to experiment. One particular piece alone, the first Javali, I had wanted to play with the music like they do in the concert format, where they have improvisation. And I had used metaphors. Here, this is a very crude woman who's confronting her, well, he's not her beloved, a man who's made many promises and seduced her and then gone back on his promises of jewelry. She's more interested in the jewels. So she says, what happened to that jewel? What happened to your promises? And I had said, it's like writing on water. What happened to those words? What happened to your words like a slippery fish? And I said words that trapped me like, you trapped me in a net of lies and deceit. And I told Jayashree, can you use just that word, martalu, which means words. When I'm doing the fish, can you flow with me? And can you have the writing on water, you do your Neraval Swaras, which is improvisation. All of which he did. So the first piece is a bit experimental that way. The others, of course, totally as Amma sang them and as the Veena Dhanamal style was sung. But I think it was personally a deeply fulfilling experience to work with Jayashree. And well, that's it.
And from music, I think inevitably we need to move into poetry. Finally, we're back to our conspiracy. I've seen VALLI choreograph different kinds of poems. Sangam poetry, as in pre-Aryan Tamil poetry, essentially. And right down to a modern English poem. We'll come to the latter shortly. But I'd like you to say something, VALLI, about your approach to poetry. Because what struck me, okay, let me make this simpler. What struck me, particularly in the way in which you picked up the Sangam poems, was your ability to respond to the image, to metaphor, without literalizing metaphor, without attempting to visually paraphrase a text, which is in fact the tyranny I was alluding to earlier. What is the poet trying to say that all of us would spend hours agonizing over in school. There was no attempt to visually transcribe those images, but the ability to capture the mystery of the image as well as invite the reader, the viewer, into that image. I think this struck me about the way in which you approached some of those Sangam poems. Your capacity to deal with metaphor without turning in any way naively literal. And then when it came to a modern English poem, which was VALLI's Brave Tryst, I think she took it on without quite knowing what she was getting into. And some months later, after having worked very hard on it, she said, I've done something really crazy. I've actually choreographed an English poem. I don't know what I'm doing, but she did it. And it then struck me that she also has this ability, which I thought was something poets are particularly attuned to, and good listeners of poetry are attuned to, which is an ability to understand tone and the very minute shifts in tone that take place in a poem. And I think this is also what, if I'm not mistaken, what also became your entry point into the Annamacharya compositions. she later did an entire evening of Annamacharya's poetry, Annamacharya being the 15th century Telugu Bhakti poet. And I think it would be interesting if you talked about any one of these, or all.
You know, I'm definitely not with poets here, with wonderful poets here. I would not presume to speak about poetry, Arun, because you have said it far more eloquently, but I would like to speak about something which I think is the point. It explains what I feel about poetry and dance. If there's some
There's a lot
music,
of music
going on
isn't it?
somewhere, isn't it? Or next door.
Downstairs.
Well,
Maybe if you just shut the door, it might help. Huh?
yeah, but I think it's just. I'll shout. You can hear. There's something I'm just going to drop this thought for you. I used to study Odissi long time back, and I was Guru Kelupcharan Mahapatra's student. I had great good bhagya to be his student for about 10 years. And I remember we were having a workshop at Gangan Mahavidyalaya, and we had all gone for lunch to Lodi Hotel somewhere. And all of us were walking along, and I don't know in what context, but Guruji started narrating the story about a tall, thin man, clad in a flowing dhoti, walking along the platform of a railway station. And as he walked with these huge strides, suddenly this Pomeranian shot out of nowhere and started making attacking, pouncing leaps at his dhoti, as the dhoti flapped as he walked. And the whole scene of the dhoti flapping and the man's little hops and leaps as he tried to evade the dog. This was about 25 years ago, but I have not forgotten that incident, and it stays in my mind as a moment where it was not that literal story. He had captured something more. You were able to see beyond that literal depiction of that to something more, to a moment of intensity, the essence of that Pomeranian attack, dhoti flapping, all coming together. And that for me was a moment, I don't know, of poetry, and which is what poetry can do when you can capture in dance I'm talking about, when you capture the intensity, you crystallize the essence of it, and you make people aware of it in a way which they never have been aware of it. So if you can do that and he was dancing it actually, so that for me was a sudden look, and it made me look beyond the dog and the Pomeranian, and I think it had a lot to do, and I've seen that with Balama, and I've seen that with Maharajji. When he was recently narrating the story about he was trying to tell this lady attendant in a hotel that he wanted a towel, and again you had that sense of something that so it was incredible, just that moment of Guruji's, and I'm not going to try to imitate him, but standing there trying to demonstrate, and her, thinking he was trying to say, come in, I want a towel, and she thought he was getting fresh and dry. This whole story which he was narrating, which was, I think, they had this capacity of abstraction to capture something which was beyond, and the essence of it without going into the banal, the prosaic, and the literal, which I think is so important. I've seen Kuryatunandana done by Guruji, and his choreography of it, again, is an abstraction of that whole sensuality of that poem. I've seen the same thing done. There was a year when I think it was the year of Kuryatunandana in Chennai. The season, about 4 dancers did it. And I must confess, they were all wonderfully gifted, beautiful dancers. But I must confess that I felt embarrassed. Very often I felt, I can't describe what happened, but it was too literal. It was dwelling too much in the literal moment, and that for me is what I feel you don't consciously do it? Something that's intuitive and also cultivated, or is it? Because I often wonder about that. Because in dance, I feel that the highest level of expression is the poetic expression of dance.
Can it be cultivated? I certainly think it can, but perhaps not if you approach a poem in this kind of expedient fashion, which is what can I extract from it? Yeah? Like a current from a bun, I want to pull out what's important. A poem is not going to yield, So, in fact, those were the kinds of conversations we had also at the time of the Annamacharya collaboration that we did. I was putting together a festival in Bombay at the NCPA, a festival of dance and bhakti poetry. And I chanced upon this wonderful book of translations of Annamacharya by David Shulman and B. Narayana Rao, called God on the Hill, which I then used liberally in my Eating God anthology as well. And what struck me about those translations was, for me, I had also grown up hearing Annamacharya, watching those compositions being performed. But for me, that was my first realization of just how subtle, how tonally inflected those poems are. And eventually I was able to coax VALLI, I think, into doing an entire production of Annamacharya.
No coaxing. I just fell into it. I was immersed in Annamacharya. She did tell me, I said, a whole production of Annamacharya. She said, no, Kshetriya and Annamacharya. She didn't expect me. Then I started reading God on the Hill, which I had bought a long time back and not read. And, it was again this amazing treasure. And the kind of songs I couldn't believe, because we are used to Annamacharya through the renditions of M.S. Amma, and many of them are the songs of praise that we're used to. And these were so different, the variety, the tones, the incredible range of emotions. So then I told Arundhati, I said, I feel perhaps I could do an entire evening. And she just said, yes, that would be fantastic.
And that's what I had in mind all along.
If you could, I really would like to ask Arundhati, do you have God on the Hill? Could you read, just read this, listen to this poem. One of the poems
I don't know how we are doing for time.
That's all right.
Are we,
There's a little bit.
it's already 1.5 hours.
It's about an hour.
Yeah.
If there's time, we'll do an Annamacharya poem, but I also know there will be questions from the audience.
Vigil, no, I would also like to speak about Vigil, which was Arundhati's poem, which I did.
No,
Can I just say that if it read either Vigil or whichever you like. I was doing a production of love poetry through the ages, and I kept telling Arundhati, I feel incomplete, I'm doing Sangram, I'm doing all kinds of things, but I need something which is also a modern poem. And she had, earlier on, in the course of some conversation, I'd asked you and you'd sent me Vigil. And it was written with Bharatanatyam dancers, she would tell you about it. But the main thing was talking, it was a wonderful experience speaking to a living poet, to discuss the song. And we had hours of conversation about it, and I discussed where I thought there were different tones, different shifts, and you remember that. And then the musician choreographed, he composed a fabric of melody for the poem. The main thing was, I know many people would have wanted it to be an abstract rendition. Perhaps I saw it as a Bharatanatyam poem. And I think Arundhati was first very taken aback because she didn't expect her poem to be translated in that kind of way. But for me, it had definite potential for Sanchari. And I saw it as a Bharatanatyam poem, not sung, but it had amazing, for me, it was something that I felt I could do.
I remember when Valli talked about that poem, she talked about it in a way that surprised me, because I realized she understood it a lot better than I did, because she talked about it in terms of a Sthai Bhava and the Sancharis. And I thought this is absolutely the right way to enter this poem. It's a poem that grew out of my own childhood unease at all those nayikas, aforementioned nayikas, who pine endlessly for their unfaithful lovers. And I knew at the same time that while I felt repelled by those figures, I also felt fascinated. So there was this great sense of fascination in the beauty, the sumptuousness of those images, but also a certain discomfort with those endlessly waiting nayikas. And that eventually turned into this poem, Vigil, which is both ironic and lyrical. And I wasn't quite sure how to explain that to Valli, so I just gave her the poem. And 3 months later, I saw that she'd actually followed it in terms of looking for the emotional axis of the poem, and then seeing the different ways in which a central tone is modulated. And that's pretty much how I actually would enter the poem. It made me conscious of the way in which I enter a poem, actually.
I'm going to request Arundhati, I know it's getting late, but if we could just end with that, perhaps, if you could read it.
We will end with that, perhaps, but I think we should also at this point pause and allow several people here to ask questions or to share comments, observations. There are people here who probably watched you dance for many years and who have their own share of questions, comments, observations.
Mic, please.
This mic can go.
No, this is the first one is always the difficult one. Somebody has to take courage and ask the question.
Ashok ji, why don't you?
Go ahead. Okay.
Yes.
You want? Yeah. Thank you.
Well, it's about the initial part of the discussion that you had, where you were demonstrating a movement and saying that the journey is important. And then you paraphrased it by saying that journey is as important as the destination. Now, I find that the destination is only here a prop to the journey and not really as important as the journey. I don't know if you can, am I reading it correctly or am I reading it wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. All I can say is that you've said it, that what is the destination really? I don't even think there is such a thing as any one destination. I've often said it even about careers, that people see us as horses in a race. Even I'm looking at something else, but we're all horses, biting, chomping, kicking, or a rat race if you like. So I could say that you enjoy running for the sake of running, without the idea of a destination which you have to reach. You get more joy out of it. So also the process, I think, matters much more even in dance. Okay, we're trying to create interpret a poem or a song in dance, but the whole process of going through the choreography for me and discovering new facets of it, for me, I don't know if that's the answer you expected, but for me it is discovery throughout as you progress down that journey. And it doesn't really, it matters what you find, and it keeps changing. The whole thing is there is no destination, because as you grow, the dance grows and changes with you. So there is no definite point that we are trying to attain, to reach.
Could you also comment on?
I think I was talking in response. When I said it in response to what she said about point A and point B. And I've always marveled at how a dancer seems to get from one point on the stage to the other without one ever realizing how those dots have been joined. That ability to just leap and to reinvent space in a way is something that's always taken my breath away. And in a sense, that is how I see poetry as well, as a kind of kinetic language that's capable of getting from one place to the other without joining the dots, at the best of times. But that one place and the other are important in some way. even though one sometimes ends up in a place one didn't intend, and that becomes the excitement, and therefore the destination is not necessarily a unitary one.
Sorry, just one.
Oh, you go
You
ahead.
know, when you're traveling from a dance point of view perspective, I said that when you're thinking only of point A and point B and the destination, it becomes very staccato. And those moments where you connect can be done differently. And the awareness changes. So that's why it's a continuous process of discovering something afresh in movement. When I'm speaking of movement,
If I may ask, I think often the classical dancers are struggling in this modern day as to being a classical dance form that you're performing. So are you traditional and therefore not modern? Are you conservative and therefore not, you're doing all these pieces that are all Ramayana and, all this stuff from whether it's Hindu mythology or whether it's... So, I look at it very differently, but I wanted to hear your perspective on that.
the point which comes up time and again, how relevant is it to you? Now, purely from a personal point of view, I think the language may be old, ancient, the idioms, the symbols. It is up to you to take that language and, I don't like this word reinvent, but what other word can we use, to make it your own, so that when you express with it, then you have, you are actually expressing who you are. In maybe an idiom which is different. The classical idiom does have its symbols and its motives which are, to some minds, archaic. But the spirit of it, it's what you do, even if you take a 2,000-year-old poem, and using the form of the classical language, I feel it is possible to infuse it with something which is very specifically your own, uniquely your own. And because I consider myself a modern woman, so it's my sensibilities which come through in that. Maybe not in a literal sense, like I'm not doing, I would sometime, I might do even that, right? Take up something totally different, do something that's abstract. But if I should take up a piece from the Ramayana, or I take up a piece wherever, Sangam poem, I relate to it, it speaks to me. And if it speaks to me, then it's up to me to communicate what it says to me to the audience. And if some people can relate, some people cannot. That again is a matter of choice and taste and sensitivity. It's okay. Doesn't matter. We have to have diverse opinions. But I think it is possible. It is finding your own, if not vocabulary, finding a way to speak in a way that makes it fresh, that makes it resonate with those who are seeing or listening to it. And I think it is possible. I can only speak from my experience, and I truly believe that I enjoy what I'm doing, and it has meaning for me. Even that very same, I'm going to do a very desolate song. One of the poems is very desolate, but in that desolation, I connect with that woman, and I hope that some of you will be able to connect, and it goes beyond just that literal again meaning to an experience which is larger. Arun, would you like to comment on that?
No, absolutely. I think, I don't want to rehash what we've already talked about in terms of relevance and narrow ideas of relevance. Also, I think one of the conversations we've had, which might be interesting if you talked about that, when she was doing the modern poem, the English poem, mine, one of the conversations we had was about whether she had to in some way become self-consciously modern in order to do it, And we realized that is just not necessary. I know for me, I myself, writing in English, modern English poet, supposedly, Anglophone Indian poet, post-colonial poet, one of the questions that I've been asked time and again is about this notion of contemporaneity. And I've always been empowered by Borges in his Harvard lectures. He says, there's really no way in which we can live in the past. Even if we wanted to, we can't. We don't have that time machine that can take us there. So, like it or not, I am helplessly contemporary in a sense, you know. So that helped me, and I think we both found a point of convergence when we were talking about that poem, in that we both saw it as heightened language of a kind. Dance is heightened language, poetry is heightened language. And that was our
Yes,
meeting
I've
point.
forgotten all about it, that we had that conversation. She's explained it wonderfully, yes.
Yes. You also speak your name, please, because we have got it.
Okay, my name is Shalini Singh. I'm an investigative journalist. I appreciate dance, but I can't say I understand fully the grammar of dance. So I came in here thinking that, I've heard a lot about you and about Arundhati as well. So I came in here thinking that I would be surprised, but I was also fearful that I might just be very disappointed, because I love both your work. And I thought, if it's another pretentious discussion, then I would end up being quite heartbroken. But I'm happy to say that it was so lovely. Every single word, the way you said it was so lovely. And you said that the best of you is crystallized when you dance. So I loved that. And my question is that if you are a thinking person, if you're a person who's evolving every day, if you're a person who's pure in any manner, as you have been pure to your dance, how important is your audience? How important is someone else understanding your creative expression? Because I think all artists are heartbroken when they are not understood fully.
That's the beginning point. You need to communicate, you need to touch. I said, basically, whatever you do, ultimately it's about speaking to somebody, it's about creating that link of Rasanubhava. Our art, at least our Raza theory, aesthetics, it's not such a subjective process where you don't need to have a response from the other person. So we begin with that premise. Having said that, I think that the wonderful thing is diversity of human nature. So some people will respond, each one in a different way. Some people purely from an intellectual point of view, some purely physical, some emotional. And ultimately, I think for classical dance, I think there is a spiritual response. And this goes beyond language, it transcends language and culture, and that has been my experience of it. That if you do something with truth, and I'm talking about, people ask me abroad, how does this dance communicate? I've had wonderful experiences. I presented the usual Margam with the Varnam and all that. I remember a lady in Spain coming up, a peasant lady, I should say peasant lady, a villager in Italy, wearing black, coming up and kneeling at my feet with tears in her eyes. And the lady in Spain, I remember, said, "Thank you, I'm a very unhappy woman. Thank you for healing. I feel something." She was weeping when she said it. So it's not about my dance, it is about the form that has the capacity to touch. So it speaks differently to different people. And that's what matters finally. And I would hope that, you said pretentious, I think that's one thing we're both allergic to, either it's Arundhati or me, that very word is something that we bristle all over when we hear it.
Yes? Suresh.
It has been wonderful listening to you, and I'm conscious that I'm really least qualified to speak on dance. You spoke of destination and the journey, but the point from which the journey begins. The question is whether it is spoken of as beginning or as origin. The reason slight digression. I had the privilege to work on a project with a very distinguished philosopher from France. And I argued for dance as one of the core categories for understanding modernity. As one of the core categories for understanding modernity. And the reasoning I gave, that is what I wish to present to you. That for modernity, what is crucial is not the idea of origins, but the idea of a beginning. But the idea of a beginning can never displace the idea of origin. And dance, if one looks at it as an anthropological universal category, it seems to me to be a metaphor for movement and a deep longing for origins.
We are silenced soon. I think that actually, honestly, that requires chewing upon, right? It's something to think about.
It's very, yeah, definitely calls for a lot of reflection. Begin to it. It's so philosophical, difficult to.
Yet another?
Sorry, I just want to extend what he was saying. Sorry, sir, I'm just trying to extend what you said. Maybe your connect with Sangam poetry is about origin.
How so?
Because it's something which is quintessentially Tamil in its content.
That is throws up another dialogue. Yes, and it can't be answered in just one question or two, but touching upon what you've said, because again that calls for a lot of reasoning and explanation. But speaking of language and culture, it is true that the cadences of the languages that we are rooted in speak to you from the subconscious in a way which, let's say, it's difficult. I was thinking about it actually on the way here, that a South Indian language or even Sanskrit, Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Kannada, Sanskrit. When I take up poems, it's easier for me to access them and then to, because I'm speaking through my body or I'm singing through my body those poems. So the cadences of that language, and sometimes I long to discover poetry in other languages which I can respond to, because how do you access these but through English translations if you don't know the language? So it is true that origins, that language, it's something which is in your marrow. So there are certain, for instance, Yentati Kulukke. There is a Javali, I'm just going off a little, digressing. I can't sing it properly, my throat is off, but Yentati Kulukke, what cheek the woman is saying. So in the music, they have sung it, you can say, Yenna Timire, Yenna Timire. You can say that in Tamil and Telugu. You can't say in English, what cheek. It's not, it won't work. So like that, there are certain things which we respond to from the gut, from deep down within. So you could say in that sense, yes, Sangam poetry origins certainly. But I'd like to think that it's possible rooting oneself there to spread and to savor all the other expressions.
Can I ask a question? Last question. Coming to communication through your dance. I'm a complete North Indian, but whenever I see any South Indian, your dance or Malvika's dance, I think it communicates. It's a matter of perception. It's a matter of how you educate yourself to understand the dance. How would you think that in today's day and age, in the contemporary age, one can play a catalyst in communicating your language to other people? Like you are dancing on English poetry, so it comes to you as English. But if for a random youngster, how would you excite that the sensory that he should like your dance? It's a positive question. It's not nothing negative I'm talking about. So that is what I want to understand. That how do I communicate with my kids? How do I communicate with their kids? Obviously, dance is beautiful, your dance. But how do I communicate? Let's say, how do I communicate Aditi's dance to South India? So
she communicates very well in South India, let me tell you that.
Yeah, she does.
Yes, she does.
But you communicate very well in your dance for pure North Indian like me. But how would you like to do with others?
With others as
others meaning other audience.
Children, you're talking
children
about
or people who are kind of a lot who are not educated in they don't have it in their DNA.
Okay, there are two issues here. Youngsters, it's a different question. That is a question that is of great concern to dancers today, classical dancers. How do we reach out to them? How do we connect? That's a different issue. But this one of responding, I think, and I don't know, that's what I was trying to say in my experience with dance, that I have danced to an unruly audience of people in some small town medical college. I don't know where it was, but it was very unruly students. And I remember as the dance started, they were creating a lot of noise, and then they quieted down after a while. Something in the dance, if there is joy and if there is celebration, it's something all of us can relate to. And so it doesn't have to specifically be I'm dancing about, again we come back to the social relevance thing, but youngsters today can relate to color, they can relate to joy, they can relate to sensuality, to rhythm. If you can, one of the most valuable compliments I received came from a young man from the Dehradun Military Academy. I did a lecture demonstration, and after that I was walking out and he came running up to me, the smart young chap, and he said, "Ma'am, I just wanted to tell you, ma'am, this Bharatanatyam fuddy-duddy thing, I don't understand head or tail, but ma'am, that was as exciting as Michael Jackson. Those were the days and it really warmed the cockles of my heart, so to speak, because I really felt that coming from this honest, spontaneous response from a young person. And the other day there was this little young chap who came up to me at the performance. I was so happy, and I tell you, that meant much more than all the great Rasikas of India coming up and telling me something. No, this honest, direct, open, spontaneous response is what I want. And if you can do that, then there is hope always for this dance, that you can communicate.
So you can, it's not a closed chapter as classical dance is concerned.
No, it's not. It's how you communicate.
Also, I think we need people to actually have it communicated to the audience. I think there's a great need for...
there is, and discernment.
Discernment.
It should not be a dialogue. You have asked your question, you got your answer. Thank you.
Yeah, it's not a dialogue. I'll have a dialogue with her separately. That's fine.
Yes. Any last question? Otherwise, you decide poems.
Yes.
I will forego Arundhati for today. Let me do the Annamacharya poem.
And also Vigil.
No, not Vigil, but Annamacharya.
I want to hear Vigil also, please. Would you I'm sure you like to listen to. One is 15th century. One is 15th century and one is 21st century. So I'd like to listen to both.
We'll do the 15th century first. And Annamacharya wrote poems in praise of Venkatesha of Tirupati. That was his Ishtadevta. But he also wrote poems. So many of these poems are the voice of the anguished seeker yearning for union with Venkatesha. But he also wrote poems in the voice, not of the male seeker, but the voice of the goddess. This is the goddess ALARMEL, and she's a spunky goddess. So when she talks to God, the tone is very, very different. So it's just the tone that I'd ask you to just listen to. And remember, here you are actually moving very close to the bedchamber. where the power equations fluctuate wildly. So you're never quite sure who's the boss. This is ALARMEL Manga. He's the master. What can I say when he says I'm better than the others? I don't even have to ask. He takes whatever I say as a command. Why should I brag? My husband is under my thumb. He's the master. Who am I to serve him when he takes joy in serving me? How can I tell you the 1,000 ways he's with me? He knows everything, just like God. And he praises me. He's the master. I'm always in his arms. He's always laughing with me. He's the God on the hill. And I'm ALARMEL Manga. Do I have to make a statement? He's my slave. He's the master. You know, vigil makes a lot of sense when you have VALLI dancing after it. But I'm not quite sure that this is the time for vigil.
May I just also add that, you know, this is a poem which both of us, I was telling Arun that the which poems I'd selected, I said, this one completely appeals to me and I'm doing this. And she said, yes, it's one of my favorite poems. So we both connected on that. The language of Annamacharya, you know, this one, I just want, Yelina Vadu Tanu, Yemanagala Nenu, Polinchi Tananurake, Pogadigaka, Pantamada Mentadana, Palumaru Tanaton. You know, the language also has this wonderful music, which it's a second discovery. First the poem, and then the beauty of that language. It was the music of that language which totally fascinated me, and then setting it to music and then dancing it. It was such a joy. I understand you, Arun dear, for having, but now
Okay, Vigil is, as I said, a poem about my own very ambivalent feelings about the Naika, who dominates so much of Indian classical dance. My fascination with her, my deep unease with her. As shadows lengthen, as the horizon smudges into secrecy, as the ocean withdraws into a misty November opacity, feelings begin to grow more medieval. And I long for you, as other lovers have before me, in a great melodic deluge, awash through history, veined silver with melancholy, deep-throated, brine-flecked with yearning. Twilight is the light for lyric poetry, a stab of blue kingfisher poetry, a small blaze of longing and regret that is almost love. Too slight for immortality, too intense to go unsung. I almost understand now why those women in the poems I ritually deplored wandered over to their mirrors, tracing against their lips the wine stain of an unforgotten passion, coiling against their necks, seething torrents of hair into a muted tempest, still electric with desire. And it feels like I too could wait for you, while I perform the erotic liturgies of another world. Wait for you who understands like none other the prosody of my breath. Wait for you, and you alone. But only until the light fades, my love. Only until the light fades.
Well, friends, so the evening comes to an end as far as this particular series is concerned. And I think you will agree with me that we had a most scintillating conversation, one of the best I ever heard with a dancer. And mind you, I have heard many dancers, as my grey hair would prove. There's hardly a dancer worth the name whom I have not talked to or not heard. And there are very few who can talk so eloquently as Arundhati said. It was a wonderful conversation because between two artists illuminating each other in many different ways. I have been very fond of saying it, arts and poetry are half-truths. Their truth is completed when the Rasika adds a bit of a truth to that. That's what completes it. And therefore there are so many truths in the single poem or in a single performance. So thank you very much. It was wonderful. We take the opportunity, of course, to announce a few things and our schedule. So we have the next Art Matters on 13th November. We are skipping October for a reason, because I'm not there. And so we have to skip it. Anyway, we will have Gayatri Sinha, the art critic, in conversation. But we have, in October, the Dayakrishna Memorial Lecture by Shiva Vishwanathan on Rights of the Mountain, Flight of a Dove, which will be in the Gulmohar Hall of India Habitat Center on 7th October, to be followed on 18th November by the Kumar Gandhar Memorial Lecture by Vijay Kichlu, who will be talking about Ustad Fayyaz Khan. So you are most cordially invited. Tell your friends. Those who do not come do not know how much they miss. How much they miss the opportunity to civilize themselves by such conversation. There are people who don't want to be civilized these days, but still, we still hope that there are enough who will like to be civilized by such conversation. Thank you very much.